Right.
Oh, it's lovely to see your face.
Thank you.
How you doing?
I'm all right. Okay. Sort of fairly hectic, busy time and all that, but yeah, doing okay.
Good. I'm glad you're keeping on, keeping on.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I won't give in or give up. Don't worry.
So, Jeremy, these conversations we're having, I've spent the last 6 months having conversations with people really kind of on the front line of the biggest issues and conversations of our time. And obviously you're one of those people. And one of the questions that's been preoccupying me is, what has someone moved beyond words? What has someone moved from seeing an issue and being upset about that or inspired by it to actually getting personally involved and making it their mission to right that wrong or have this thing in the world that they want to see realized? And what are the inspirations? So where we kind of start is obviously where you started, your childhood. Where did you grow up? What were you surrounded by? And what were the influences on you that you believe help shape your worldview?
I grew up in a rural community in Shropshire. My mum and dad were both working. My dad was an engineer. My mum was a teacher. And they were both very conscious politically, both active at various times in their lives on peace and social justice issues, unions, Labour Party, and so on. They didn't push politics down the throats of myself and my brothers at all, quite the opposite. Encouraged us to read, think for ourselves. And I was influenced, obviously, by that environment. School environment where I was usually in a minority, and indeed I gave a talk to a group of sixth formers in the school I went to last week as a leaving gift for the politics teacher there, and they asked me about what it was like in school at that time, and I said, well, it was great fun being a minority of one on issues like fox hunting and a number of other issues, because it was a rural community which was sadly quite keen on fox hunting in those days. And so that, but also I was influenced by my desire to see the wider world beyond this small town and this small community. I recognise the sense of solidarity one gets in a small community, but also the sense of isolation that's there as well. There's conflicting emotions surrounding it. And at school, I was always very interested in both history and geography, in the sense of the way in which history is taught and understood, and of course the way in which we look at the rest of the world. And so I remember as a young person poring over those huge Times atlases, looking at various places all around the world. This is long pre-internet days. And so there was a certain pleasure in getting a big atlas with the coloured maps on and looking at it all, and then thinking about those places and the history that came from them. So I've always had this thirst for that. And then my influences were that I wanted to see places, explore ideas, but always a sense of the injustice of poverty, the injustice of discrimination, and the injustice of war and what that's done to so many people's lives. So those are factors that heavily influenced my life. And then later on, I was living in Jamaica for 2 years and Latin America, and then did lots of jobs and not particularly successful in post-school education, and then worked for as union organizer for the National Union of Public Employees, which was now part of Unison, which was I was organising school meals workers, school cleaners, hospital ancillary staff, and many others. And I got a lot of inspiration from the bravery and the commitment of many of those people in standing up against low pay and the way in which they were institutionally discriminated against as working class women trying to achieve something in life. So there's many influences, but we're all a product of there's no one environment, there's lots of environments. I don't think there's that many light bulb moments people have. They think they do, but in reality, those that think they've had a light bulb moment that makes them something different were probably searching for the light anyway.
Yeah, I've actually found that myself. I used to sort of date my kind of radicalisation into sort of social justice warrior as my first trip to Palestine. But then actually later on realising that there were so many influences before that even got me on the plane in the first place, that it is that kind of these things coming together, but you sort of tend to construct a narrative for yourself after the fact. Can you remember the process that took place in your mind that had you become an MP?
Well, I never set out in life to become a member of Parliament. I never set out in life to do the various jobs and positions I've had. I set out in life to try and be on the side of those that have suffered injustice and acted accordingly. And I was asked if I'd like to become a councillor in Haringey. I was active in the Labour Party and the local community, and indeed was selected and became a councillor for the ward that's actually adjacent to my own constituency now. It was called South Hornsey in those days. And Islington North Labour Party had been through various convulsions, one of which was its MP, Michael O'Halloran, was a very controversial figure and was within the party locally. He then joined the Social Democratic Party, and at that point the local party then set about selecting a new candidate, and a number of members of Islington North asked me to put my name forward. I did, and then we had months and months of interviews and debate and hustings and so forth, and eventually I was selected very narrowly at a General Management Committee selection conference in 1982, and I was then therefore the candidate. There was then a boundary change, so I was selected again for the new constituency just before the 1983 general election, and I was very struck by the demands placed on MPs to know something about everything. Mm-hmm. And I remember one evening canvassing lots of doors on various places around the constituency, and I got home and made a list of all the subjects that had been raised with me that evening. It was dozens of them, and so you realise not how much you know, how little you know about so much, and also where to go for information. And so I dedicated myself towards the community end of politics. Opening a local office, which was unusual in those days, doing a walkabout almost every Sunday around the constituency, just knocking on doors and seeing what people had to say and what their problems were, founding a pensioners forum, working with the tenants groups and the local unions and many other groups. And then of course the miners' strike happened.
You know, it is our energy, it's this country's energy. We should be proud of having that, never mind trying to shut everything down.
Well, while ever this country requires energy, it can burn coal. And the alternative is if you have nuclear power, you're going to have thousands of people on the dole, so how do they pay the electric bills? It's a vicious circle, because it's a minority of capitalists who can only see pounds, shillings and pence, and not the social consequences to it.
And I was flat out involved in local politics and the miners' strike, and travelled all over the country in support of the miners, and that took us through to 1985 and the defeat of the miners and the political reckoning that came as a result of that. It was a sad and tragic time. But the interesting thing was the sense of solidarity that grew between those from Kent, from South Wales, from East Midlands, and many other places that came to our constituency. We had the Red Rose Centre in those days, and across the borough we calculated around £100,000 in cash for the miners across the borough, which you think in 1984, 85 was a phenomenal sum of money. And the relationships that were born of miners that had come from mining, obviously from mining communities, was significant with the local community. So local Black community, local Irish community, local migrant communities, local tenants movements. And I've still got pictures of a coach that we hired and took to Canary Valley in South Wales to support those at Tower Colliery. And I'm still in touch with Tyrone O'Sullivan, who was then the secretary of the lodge there. And we've got pictures of this group arriving in South Wales with a coachload of people and vast amounts of food to help support the miners. People forget how brutal it was. The Tory government cut the social security payments to miners, tried to cut the benefits to their families, and the only way they could survive was loans, debts and gifts. And I remember another time taking a van load of food up the M1 to Hatfield Main Colliery, and 3 or 4 of us went in this van load of food. Much of the food was given by local Turkish and other shops. Just said, here's a sack of rice, here's a case of canned food of some sort. And so we took all that, and it was the solidarity of people that maintained those mining communities during that period. And it's hard to explain to people of a different generation just how brutal it was. And as we were travelling north up the M1, we're driving northwards, coming southwards, we saw lots of police vehicles. And then we overtook a convoy of slow-moving police vehicles. It was the changing of the guard as the Metropolitan Police week-long deployment in South Yorkshire was taken northwards to replace those coming southwards. And that was just before Orgreave. And so I'm very determined that there should be a public inquiry into what happened at Orgreave during the miners' strike.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting you talk about that period of time, because, you know, you enter Parliament in 1983, which is just such a significant year in terms of the Labour Party, in terms of domestic politics. You know, we Thatcher gets her second term. We sort of begin really the sort of in earnest sort of rightward drift, the sort of battle between, you know, is Labour going to be a socialist party or something else? And into the Houses of Parliament walks Jeremy Corbyn. And I was actually watching in advance of this a lot of interviews and things with you from that period of time. It was really fascinating to see the tone with which those interviews with you were conducted. Was just breathtaking.
The man insisting on higher sartorial standards from his fellow members is Tory MP Terry Dix. He says that Labour scruffs like Robin Corbyn should be barred from addressing the House unless they pull their socks up.
You know, there's one where they're sort of on about how scruffy you look, and you give this fabulous response about, you know, these, you know, bloated MPs rolling into the House of Commons, you know, in their dinner jackets, you know, voting and then napping off to the bar. And it's so discordant with the rest of the kind of the political tone of the time. It really, what was that like for you?
I got some great advice on the first day I was in Parliament from the late great Joan Maynard. She was MP for Sheffield Brightside, and she'd been a farm worker activist in North Yorkshire in Thirsk, and she was a great friend of mine, and I always worked with her with the Agricultural Workers Union, now part of Unite the Union, on issues of tied cottages and so on, because I came from a rural community where the tied cottage issue was a very serious one. And I remember Joan giving me a cup of tea in the members' tea room with Harry Cohen, who was then MP for Leighton. And she said, just a bit of advice, if I may. And I said, please, Joan, please give me some advice. She said, listen, if both front benches are agreed on something, and the minister gets up at the dispatch box and says, I'm having to make some very tough decisions. Watch out. It'll be the working class and the poorest who will be hardest hit by those decisions. When they always talk about tough decisions, it's always somebody else that's going to be hit. And Joan stood me in good stead with her advice, and she became a great friend. And indeed, she spoke at my mother's funeral. And I attended her funeral in Thirsk later on. She was an amazing woman. And I learnt a lot from her and her background.
So we have the 80s, and then we have, of course, the 90s. and the sort of the rise of Blairism within the party, and the sort of the scrapping of Clause 4 and those sorts of things. And obviously I was, in researching for this, but obviously I'm like you, I'm an avid student of history. I'm very hungry and sort of devour history. And so you look at that time and you look at this time and you think there are real similarities with the sort of the struggles that we're having today as socialists and the struggles that were had then. And you wonder, really, is there ever any change in terms of the struggle itself?
Well, in some ways, no, because Tony Benn said this. We were doing a kind of call about Tony Benn with Crispin Flintoff last night. It was very interesting. And we played one of Tony's speeches in Parliament about when Thatcher stood down. And he was talking up for the skilled workers and labourers and everybody else that had built this country, built its industries, built its infrastructure, built its services, and the way in which the Thatcherite spivs were busy wrecking the economy and selling off to the lowest bidder and all the rest of it, which is what they did. And Tony always said at the end of the miners' strike, there is no final victory, there is no final defeat. You have to fight the same old struggle over and over again to assert those values. And Tony drew great inspiration from history, his studying of history, and he was particularly motivated by the levellers and the diggers of the English Civil War and their opposition to Cromwell. And he was very proud to speak at Burford every year. Burford, where the levellers were shot in the churchyard by Cromwell's agents, because they opposed Cromwell and his protection of the inequality of land ownership in Britain in the Commonwealth period after the Civil War had been concluded. And also they opposed being marched to the Welsh coast in order to go to Ireland to occupy Ireland on behalf of Cromwell. Well, Britain was already in Ireland, but to put down Irish uprisings. And Tony drew great strength from them as people whose principles stand the test of time. And I've just finished reading a fascinating book called The Many-Headed Hydra, which is about, it's called The Revolutionary Atlantic. And it is about the slave uprisings in the Caribbean, in the Americas, and the slave uprisings in the northern part of the USA, in New York, and indeed in Massachusetts, where slavery actually carried on, even when it was theoretically illegal.
Yeah.
And the way the inspiration that came from a lot of those people, many of whom were executed for taking part in these uprisings, came from the debates of the English Civil War, the Putney debates. And the book, quite brilliantly, navigates between what is happening or happened at that time all over the Americas with the fundamental debates and the way in which the English Civil War protagonists split between Lilburne and the Levellers and the Cromwell supporters. Lilburne and the Levellers opposed colonialism, opposed imperialism, and opposed the slave trade, whereas Cromwell, of course, was very happy to develop an English empire as soon as he got himself into a controlling position in England. And in some ways, those debates about colonialism and the legacy of it are now played out through the Black Lives Matters movement and the whole debate about the way in which we teach history. And so it's about empowering people through understanding where those radical thoughts go. And so when somebody stands up against something that's unjust, motivated by it, they might not win, but you never know where the acorn will fall and what oak tree will grow in the future.
Well, really, I think you and I are probably a couple of those little oak trees in a way, and so is the rest of the socialist movement, really, because I think one of the things that was most striking about you from my perspective, and this goes way back, and this sort of brings us up to the Iraq War period, really, is, you know, at that point in time, 2003, I was fresh back from my second delegation trip to Palestine. So I'd spent several months across 2002 in the occupied territories in Gaza and the West Bank, seeing just the most brutal oppression of people. I was only 21, and, you know, little 21-year-old Bristolian from Kingswood, you know, hadn't seen much of the world at this point. And I was shell-shocked, really. I mean, it was, you know, the type of horror that you hope you're never going to see. And then right hot on the heels of that was the decision to invade Iraq. And I felt this, I can't even describe, anger doesn't cover it, rage doesn't cover it, grief doesn't cover it, just this cumulative sense of injustice, knowing now from a first-hand perspective, having seen what was happening in Palestine, what it actually means when the war machine enters a civilization and it seeks to destroy it. And we find ourselves, a million of us walking through London and Glasgow and all over the place. And there's you speaking in Hyde Park. And I was in the audience. I was stood in Hyde Park that day. I watched that speech and I cried for the entire 2 minutes, you know, from beginning to end, because it was so clear to me that you weren't virtue signaling. You were, and you got that distinction between the levelers and the Cromwell distinction of sort of socialism or revolution, is that no one is left behind. You know, so if socialism means anything, it's universal in its application. You don't create a queue and say, oh, you know, well, we'll give, you know, this interest group needs to be prioritized over that interest group. Because actually we're all just as important as each other. All of our needs are as important. And you fought for that. And I think when
that demonstration was a lot of organising, and as a founder of the Stop the War Coalition, I was very involved in the practical organisation of it, as well as all the build-up. And I did hundreds of meetings against the Iraq War all over the UK, in Europe, and in the USA. I went twice to the USA to do meetings there, and it was really poignant speaking in Washington against the war at a public meeting. The temperature was absolutely freezing. It was -8 or something, and my teeth were chattering, and it was hard to speak like this because it was so cold, but I did manage to get the speech out. And then we got to organising the big events for February the 15th, 2003. And some of it was, there was some quite sort of funny, poignant moments. We had a meeting with the Metropolitan Police the day before to finalise what we were planning to do and what the police were expectations of it were. And we'd always had a policy that we would never discuss with the police expected numbers that are going to come on demonstrations, because the danger is that if you say the number that's going to come and then there's less that come, it's already got in the media, so it then turns out into being a fake. So the police looked at Chris Niner and me and said, okay, Mr. Corbyn, how many people are you expecting tomorrow? So I looked at Chris and sort of shrugged my shoulders and said, I don't know, it'll probably be quite big. And they said, well, what do you mean quite big? I said, well, we normally get between 100 and 200,000. We think it's going to be a bit bigger than that tomorrow, but it's impossible to say. But don't worry, it's going to be well stewarded. We'll be fine. We want to get a political message out across the whole world. And so they then pushed a bit more and said, well, would it be as big as 500,000? I said, listen, I really can't get into these numbers because I don't know. But it's going to be bigger than normal. That's all I'd say. And they said, okay, well, our estimation is it's going to be between 500,000 and 1 million. That was the police figure the day before. And it turned out to be over 1 million that came because the streets were also full of people that never got into the park. And the thing is, when you finally get to a rally at the end of that, you've had this intense process of building up to it, all the hassles. Were we going to be allowed to even rally in Hyde Park? Never mind anything else. And then the global nature of it and the fact that there were 600 demonstrations all around the world and keeping up with all of that and lots of media requests in the run-up. So I'd written a speech actually, which I then stuck in my pocket and put away and ignored. And then just before I was invited on the stage to speak, I made a few notes in a notebook, little notebooks like this, and made my speech because I just felt this is an occasion that's of historic proportions, biggest ever audience in Britain, and probably will remain so. And we got a message out of this.
Thank you to every single person that's here today in the biggest ever political demonstration in the history of this country.
Sadly, the war took place. Sadly, all the predictions we made of the terrorism, the wars, and the refugees have all come to pass. I just hope to goodness that we never, ever go to war on a lie, on misinformation, and end up with the tragedy that was that war in Iraq.
Ditto. It's really difficult, again, to describe for people who weren't there, because obviously we've got a whole new wave of young socialists coming into the movement now, some of whom weren't even born when that speech happened, when that, war began, or invasion. And I was entertained actually during your leadership. I can remember sort of Guardian articles and stuff like that saying, get over Iraq, let it go. And people fundamentally not understanding what a radicalizing issue that was, because it, you, Chris Nineham, Lindsay German, all of the other people that were really pivotal at that moment in time.
There's a generational thing in this, which is a very important point you make there. A whole generation's opinions on the world were formed by the Iraq demonstrations and the build-up to it. And earlier generations' opinions were formed by opposition to the Vietnam War. And since I grew up in the 1960s, I was obviously part of that generation opposed to the Vietnam War. And same kind of arguments, same kind of abuse was heaped upon us for opposing the Vietnam War. And my parents' generation's opinions were often formed from support for the Spanish Republic in the 1930s, when the fascists were occupying Spain, when Hitler was providing support for the Franco forces in Spain. And so there are sort of crucial moments of world history that do form people's opinions and how they relate to the rest of the world. And I think that Iraq generation are a crucial one. I hope that the current generation's views of the world will be formed by the sense of solidarity of Black Lives Matter's movement around the world. I hope their opinions will also be formed by that sense of solidarity around the world that is necessary to deal with the climate emergency and the environmental emergency, and also the corona crisis. And so, optimistically, I think the generation of 2020s will be influenced by that sense of solidarity and hopefulness, rather than that sense of anger and desperation that we had against a war. I want people united for something rather than against something.
Absolutely. And there are, it's fascinating. I mean, one of the things that was so distinctive about your leadership of the Labour Party in that moment in 2015, I say a moment, it was a series of moments, really. I recall, I was, again, re-watching it for this interview, and the hustings, you know, the live television debates between sort of yourself, Yvette Cooper, Liz Kendall and Andy Burnham. And the response from the audience to you was very similar to the response many of us have had to you over the years, the people who've discovered you. And it's that sort of refreshing, wait, that's a person. that's actually a human being, you know, stood there, whose humanity is intact and on full display, who is promoting a vision of something positive. And it's so rare, actually, in our politics at the moment that you actually see that it cuts through kind of all of the nonsense. And there's this brilliant exchange with if there's Yvette Cooper and you, and Yvette Cooper's sort of trying to drum up some sort of theatrical anger about, Jeremy, how can you lead these people, you know, basically, how can you lie to these people that you can just make all these problems go away and that you could eradicate poverty? And you just very calmly, you say, you know,
the magic money tree one.
Yeah, and you just think, yeah, we've had quantitative easing.
Yeah, there is a magic money tree. It's growing well. It's on the Cayman Islands. It's thriving in every tax haven.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, and it was just such a great moment because you realise how, without the intervention, and I mean, this might be a point you'd like to expand on, really, because we're in a situation where we have a media which is almost uniform in its politics. You know, we're talking about angels dancing on the head of a pin in terms of the, you know, the difference between them. And ditto in the sort of the politics, sort of everyone has coalesced around the idea that there is no alternative. The only option we've got is maybe to ameliorate some of the worst effects of capitalism here or there to a greater or lesser extent. But that there is no alternative to what we have, which of course makes people desperate and hopeless and almost start fighting amongst each other for the scraps. And what you were saying, you entered that conversation with, sorry, carry on.
That's absolutely the point, that we had reduced ourselves to discussing how we would implement austerity brought about by the banking crisis of 2008, 2009. And so we ended up saying, well, we wouldn't freeze everybody's wages, we'd freeze some people's wages, but we need the investment, therefore we're going to give tax breaks to the very rich in order that Facebook might come and build an office somewhere. That sort of philosophy. And it obviously disempowers everybody, depresses everybody, and doesn't take anybody anywhere further forward. So you then take it to a global level. You pursue market economics to its umpteenth degree. You allow the global corporations tax breaks, tax havens, tariff-free ports, or whatever, all around the world. What you end up with is the biggest corporations playing ducks and drakes with people's lives. So Rolls-Royce workers in Barnsley today are threatened with job loss because Rolls-Royce wants to move blade manufacture to Singapore, where there'll be no irritating unions and nobody making big pressures on them, and presumably the tax arrangements will be accordingly a lot easier for them. Those workers are victims of globalization in exactly the same way that the Indian farmers from the Punjab and other parts of India are now demonstrating in New Delhi against the ending of the Nehru era price support for farmers' products, which obviously helps to put more money into the rural communities, and they're going to be put at the mercy of market forces. Exactly the same way that structural adjustment programs in the 1980s forced African governments to end price support for farming communities and open themselves up to the imports of subsidized maize from the USA. And so it goes on around the world. And all those protests add up to a different economic strategy. So I was trying to put forward a different economic strategy in 2015 in the leadership election and a year later, and in the general elections. And John McDonnell and his team took that many stages further down the road with a carefully thought out, prepared and presented economic plan that would have begun a process of empowerment of people and of redistribution of wealth and power in our society. That surely is what we exist as a movement for, and that is what we put forward, and we will continue to put forward. And I tell you this, if this government thinks it's going to get away with huge job losses next year because of the post-corona cuts they're trying to bring in, instead of investing in economies and the future and an environmentally sustainable future, then there's going to be big issues and big conflicts. Why should the poorest people pay the price for a virus that's not of their making, an economic injustice that was foisted upon them by an arrogant elite that wanted to continue the concentration of wealth and power to the wealthiest? The pandemic billionaires are the ones who should be paying the tax bill.
Absolutely. Well, especially when you consider just how much their wealth is growing at a time when, you know, the wealth for really the majority of the planet is contracting sharply. You have to wonder where the pinch point is going to come here. You know, the way we've sort of characterized it is almost sort of the billionaire class seems to have ripped up the social contract their end. And meanwhile, certainly in the Western world, most of the working class are still upholding their end of that social contract. And you've got to wonder when...
The only thing I would disagree with you is I'm not sure the billionaire class ever totally signed up to the social contract. But,
I'm far too generous to billionaires.
You're very generous.
Well, I think mostly it was just a negotiation, wasn't it? I mean, they thought we'll throw a bit more at them to stop them becoming communists, you know, in the Cold War period, and that threat's gone now, so they're safe to just yank it, you know, back. Yeah. So that brings us to the present day. Here we are in 2020, just going into 2021. What are the issues that are forefront at your mind today?
The stress, the poverty, and the fear that's being brought about by the corona crisis. Yes, those that have contracted it or suffer it, older people that are frightened of getting it, and whole communities that have been told to stay home and lock down. If a government says you cannot work, you cannot go out, then that government is taking onto itself a responsibility to make sure you survive during that period. They're not doing that because the furlough payments don't add up to 100% of wages. And for those on 0 hours contracts and insecure work, they don't get the protection either. And the mental health stress that's there and the pain, particularly for young people, is absolutely huge. Those obviously concern me greatly, as does the environmental crisis that we're in. There's no denying it. Global warming, there's no denying it. Loss of ecosystems and biodiversity, there's no denying levels of pollution. That means we've got to do things very differently. But we don't achieve environmental sustainability in the future by punishing those people that work in industries that do pollute. You have to recognise that everybody's got to be brought into the equation on this. Hence, we worked very hard on the Green Industrial Revolution. I remember talking to Becky Long Bailey and others about this, how we had to devise a strategy and a policy that was not threatening to communities, but was supporting of them. And we were pointing out that every other industrial revolution, the steam age revolution, the electric age revolution, the digital revolution, have all been accompanied by massive disruptions, but also a transfer of wealth and power from the poorest to the richest in their initial phases. our industrial revolution was going to be the other way around. It was going to be transferring wealth and power to the communities to empower them at the level they need to be. And that's, I think, the issues that we face over the next few months. Opposition to this government's economic strategy, but above all, hope and support for people that are going through such terrible times at the present time.
That's brilliant. And on hope and support, I know there was sort of a common view amongst sort of centrists in Westminster that somehow 500,000 new members to the Labour Party were all cultists. But I think that was a really politically uneducated explanation of your popularity. I think
it's not about me, it's about people wanting hope and difference in their lives.
Exactly.
I've obviously met and know many people in the Labour Party of all ages and outlooks. And what I noticed more than anything else was that of the huge number of new members that came in 2015, 16, 17, and so on, up to the high point, which was almost 600,000 members, was their political diversity, as well as their age diversity, gender balance, and that they were all searching for something better. They were searching for something good, but they were searching for a space to discuss, a space to debate, a space to put their ideas forward. And I have met many members at roundtable meetings and so on, and Green Industrial Revolution roundtables, and I was always amazed by the variety of opinions. And some people would appear quite right-wing on economic issues, but very left-wing on social justice issues, like there's no connection. And so you'd have a discussion, not in a threatening way, not in an aggressive way. You have a discussion. And we educate ourselves through our own experience and listening to each other. And that's what is so impressive about bringing people together in a movement where you're empowered by each other's learning curve. And none of us are so knowledgeable that we can walk by somebody else because they're going to know something we don't know.
Yeah, generally someone has the missing piece that you require to advance your knowledge in any given area.
Absolutely.
So here we are today. You're no longer the leader of the Labour Party. We won't go into the whip. But regardless of that, you remain the figurehead of the socialist movement as far as the United Kingdom is concerned. That isn't changing anytime soon. There's probably a baton to be handed over at some point, but it's certainly not being handed over yet. And one of the things that people say to me most commonly when I ask, firstly, they say there's no such thing as Corbynism. I'm a socialist. I was a socialist before Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, and I'm a socialist now, and I don't plan on changing because it's a fundamental belief system.
That's the right answer.
And the second thing they say is that the reason that you remain the figurehead is because you turned up before it was fashionable and you stayed after it was no longer fashionable. There's this sense that you've been on the right side of history throughout, decades. And there's a trust there that says, okay, this is an ally. This is whether I speak as sort of an intersectionalist dream here. I'm autistic, I'm mixed race, I'm gay, and I grew up in a working class community in the 80s. Allies in the world of politics were few and far between. And, if someone was an ally on one thing, they might actually be actively trying to damage me in another way. So you had this constant sense of, why can't there be a movement or a political leader who respects all of these elements, the gender, the sexual orientation, race, and those things. And there you were. So as we move forward and we have so many fights ahead and so much that we can achieve together, if we retain our solidarity, retain our focus, and retain our mission, what do you have to say to those hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of people, millions in fact, out there, for whom you are still the figurehead of this movement. What do you have to say to them today about the future of our movement?
Stay together, stay active, stay optimistic, and above all, stay hopeful, because these are times of stress, of course. All times there's degrees of stress, but there's also that sense of a movement in this country on corona, on environment, on industry, on services, on jobs. And all those people that have come out in mutual aid groups to support each other, all those people that have worked together in communities to help people get through the stress of this crisis is huge. And the same kind of movements are actually all over the world. Earlier on in this discussion, we mentioned Black Lives Matters movement, mentioned the global human rights movement, and that sense of re-examining our own history that's come from it. And so I play my part. I love representing my community and my constituency, and my job is to support people and encourage them, and ensure that there is that space for socialists, for political debate, for a global strategy based on peace, justice, democracy and human rights, for a strategy based on environmental sustainability. And these things are, to me, very, very important. And I say to people, look, if you stay home and shout at the television, it won't make a lot of difference. It'll probably damage your throat. It'll make no difference whatsoever to the television. But if you go out with others and support them, if they're fighting to defend a hospital, if they're fighting to get a park, they're fighting to clean a river, whatever it happens to be, you might not win. No guarantee. There's no guarantees of winning things, but you'll be so strengthened by the experience of doing so. And it's that sense of optimism that gets from our strength, but also understanding what power is. Power is, of course, people that are in powerful positions, running big businesses, running companies. They've been elected to positions in unions, elected to positions in parliament, councils, and so on. Yes, those are all important, powerful positions. But nothing actually happens unless somebody else does it, without workers to do it. And the power people have in their own communities, in their own workplace, is something that we need to educate people for. So nobody's forgotten, nobody's left behind, nobody's cowed. But it does mean you have to have philosophy, that you don't pass by on the other side to those that have suffered the most. And I'm always impressed by the sense of optimism that some people give. I've never forgotten visiting a refugee camp on the borders of Syria and Iraq. This was before the war in Syria, some while ago. And it was winter, it was cold, it was wet, it was horrible. And this was a camp that had some UN refugee support, but not enough. And they were living in tents, and they were trying to heat them with gas burners. And sadly, the gas burners in some places got out of control and burnt the tent down. And some people had died trying to get out of a burning plastic tent. Horrible, absolutely vile and horrible. And I was talking to this family, and this girl, about 14, and I said to her, "What's your ambitions?" Here she is, refugee girl in a tent in Iraq-Syria border, in a pretty hopeless situation. And she looked at me and she said, "You know what? I want to be a doctor."
Oh.
And I said to her, "Why?" She said, "To help people that are worse off than myself." And she is of a refugee community that would be condemned by the Daily Mail, by the Sun, and by so much of our mass media. She's a human being determined to do good for other people. let's look at refugees in a different way.
That's beautiful, Jeremy. Got me crying over here, damn you. Oh, goodness. Where to finish?
Actually, that's not a bad place to finish on.
I think that's pretty good. I don't think we're going to top that moment. That's absolutely beautiful. Really is. I'm going to retain that one. Just thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the time. It's been really good. I've really enjoyed the interview. Fantastic. Thank you, Canary. So let's all support the Canary.
We are in the fight of our lives, and we're asking you to join that fight. Almost all of our media is owned by 3 billionaires who have overseen a power grab by right-wing forces. Conversations we thought were consigned to the dustbin of history are back with a vengeance. Jeremy Corbyn was just shy of 2,000 votes away from winning the 2017 general election. There is no doubt that without the coordinated smear campaigns of right-wing Labour staffers and their friends in the media, the Johnson government would never have happened. So it's on us to do the work of the Fourth Estate. It's on us to fight back. And you are an important part of that. There is no other outlet like the Canary. It's a truly working class, left-wing media outlet committed to campaigning journalism. And we make our work accessible to everyone. You don't need a PhD in political science to understand our stories, because we write them to be understood, not to prove we own a thesaurus. And our newsroom looks and sounds every bit as diverse as the world we live in.
We are black, brown
and white.
Some of us have advanced degrees.
Some of us have
a few GCSEs.
We live in
and write
from our communities
across the UK
and beyond.
We're proud to sound like
where we are from.
And with your help,
we are going to
fight back.
We know how scary things are. We've been right by your side through every terrifying minute of it. And we have never faltered. We have never betrayed our values or you, no matter how much pressure was put on us. We have built the team we need to fight this fight, but we can't continue to fund them without your support. If you value our work, help us reach the 5,000 subscribers we need to make the Canary soar. So join us. Yes, you watching this right now. I want to welcome you to Team Canary. Go to the Canary website, click support. I'll see you there.